Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Thomas. Today we're back here with Extra History. Yep, finally coming back to this again. Today, it's the 3rd century crisis of Roman history. So, yeah, definitely the start of Roman's fall. Definitely one of their biggest, crises before the big event, I guess you could say. It's best I could describe it, so whatever works, I guess. Let's check it out. Be sure to like, subscribe for more. Hope you enjoy. Here we go. All complete.
August 24th, 410 CE. For the first time in 800 years, barbarians are in Rome. This is personal. This is revenge. Some of these Visigoths had been Roman soldiers until the emperor, questioning their loyalty, had their wives and children murdered.
Which
they
ones?
burned churches and
Sorry, I
sacked
had to
imperial tombs, scattering the emperor's ashes from their burial urns. They
Yikes.
torture the population to give
Messy.
up their valuables and take citizens as slaves. It is the fate that Rome has been trying to stave off for centuries, an undeniable symbol that the Western Empire is falling. And it had nearly happened before, over a century earlier, during a time of division and chaos. Germanic tribes nearly reached the city, Rome was torn by civil war, and the economy in freefall. But then, just as the empire seemed destined to tear itself apart, a pair of remarkable emperors managed to preserve the stricken empire for another 2 centuries. Aurelian and Diocletian.
200 years. Okay, there you go.
This complete Roman tale is brought to you by Nebula, where you can catch all of our shows at least a full week earlier than on YouTube, all ad-free.
Here we go. Take a stab at Rome. Step. Let's see where this whole thing starts.
This is the story of how Rome nearly tore itself apart, a time when the greatest empire of the Western world entered what is known as the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year tailspin that sent it spiraling toward disaster. And it's also the story of 2 emperors, Aurelian and Diocletian, who managed against all odds to reverse the trend and save the empire, at least for a while. The 3rd century crisis was a terrible time, but with 1700 years of distance, it can also look a little bit like a comedy of errors. And explaining why the 3rd century crisis happened also takes a bit of time. Because despite its name, it wasn't a single crisis, rather a series of overlapping crises that both magnified and fed on each other. And that's what...
So, yeah, basically, I guess just issues kept piling up till basically the whole thing crashed. Which, again, the economy, military, and outside forces, woof, that can pretty much take down any empire. They got lucky. Though, I don't remember how Aurelian and Diocletian actually did it, but, well, if you know Romans, it's always about just conquering the land. I mean, that's pretty much how they do it. Anyway, back to it.
Why Rob actually tends to prefer the less academic, more descriptive term of the military anarchy. But the many problems Rome had all centered around one thing. The Roman Empire was too big. Because while the so-called bad emperors deserved blame for the state falling into disrepair and neglect, the good emperors still had been the ones that stretched the bounds of the empire to encompass the entirety of...
Oh, wait, there's some extra context here. Territorial expansion will often trigger instability at home. Historians have suggested it's actually a poor measure of imperial success. Yeah, that's actually a fair point, because let's be real. Honestly, I could see that, since, sure, you get more power, more land that falls under your rule, but yeah, I could definitely see that's a bad idea. Like, if they can't manage it, well, why would you need it? Anyway.
Of the Mediterranean and all the way to Britain. Even Rome, which spent half of its entire budget each year on the military, didn't have enough troops to secure that territory. Shoring up one part of the empire often meant neglecting another. And due to the great distances, armies dispatched to reinforce local troops against uprising or invasion often arrived too late. And this weakness did not pass unnoticed by the people living on Rome's borders.
Oh boy.
Sassanid Persia invaded the east, only to be turned back by a Roman alliance with Palmyra, which you can hear about in our Odenathus episode. Also, Germanic tribes raided the northern borders and occasionally coalesced into powerful groups that stormed south, at times even into Italy. Matching these external pressures were internal ones, particularly Rome's method of imperial succession, which Rob assures me was very unique and intricate. You know what? Let me just read it verbatim to make sure I get it right. Rob?
And nothing there.
The page is blank, buddy. Oh wow. Turns out there was absolutely no codified method for imperial succession. There were traditions, of course.
Fair.
A lot of emperors chose a successor, trained him for years, adopted him as a son, and installed him as a sort of junior co-emperor known as a Caesar so he could learn the job and take over. But that wasn't a law. It was more of what we'd call today a sort of norm. Technically, if you could get an army to declare you emperor and then the Senate to confirm it, then you were just the emperor. And this was a real problem. Especially when the army, particularly the emperor's bodyguard, known as the Praetorian Guard, realized that they could serve as kingmakers, killing the emperor and installing a popular general in his place. The reasons for launching a coup could be many, from disagreements about policy to simply wanting a payday. Because you see, when a new emperor came to power, he was expected to financially reward his troops and officers, meaning you could get very rich by giving your general the imperial robe, and then you could get paid again by killing him and bringing in a new guy. Easy money. Now,
that's a little messed up.
Had happened before, but generally, the beneficiaries were family members of the emperor, aristocrats steeped in politics. In the 3rd century crisis, however, a long line of soldiers would end up running the empire. And though the underlying issues had been there for decades, this problematic time began with Emperor Severus Alexander. It's the year 235, the 13th year of the young emperor's reign. He'd come to the throne as a teenager, fought the Persians to a standstill in the east, and watched with disquiet as the army grew ill-disciplined and restless. Now, Alexander is in Germania, ready to confront barbarians who have raided across the border. His commanders have a meeting in his tent to lay out their grievances. His monetary policies, the way he'd listened to his mother for political advice, and his plan to bribe the barbarians into disbanding rather than crushing them. Then with a shout, the swords unsheath. Alexander's guards make a noble stand, but within minutes, the emperor and his mother have been slain. The army then declares its general, a man with a peasant background named Maximinus Thrax, as emperor. Now, he would only rule for 3 years and never set foot in Rome before the Senate revolted, naming another man and his son co-emperors, stripping Maximinus from his throne. Thus began the year of 6 emperors. Wait a minute. 6 emperors? In 1 year? And we're going to do them all in this chapter? I mean, okay, but that's kind of fast for this sort of thing. Hold on. How many emperors were there during the 3rd century crisis? Well, 26. 26 legitimate emperors? Like, were there also illegitimate ones? All in 50 years. How are we supposed to get through all that?
You know when you go through that many rulers, you know you're in for a rough time. You know?
Jazzy,
just saying.
All right,
I just hope we don't have to go through that.
Get ready to get up and move. Because we're going to blaze right through the 14 emperors between Maximinus Thrax and our good boy Aurelian in the most efficient and groovy way possible. You ready? A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3. Them Rome's gonna stab around. Them Rome's gonna stab around. 3rd century crisis gonna shake the ground. Let's count the emperors down. Well, the first guy committed suicide when he found out his co-ruler's son died. And they were succeeded by these guys, and they were in charge 3 months.
3 months?
But then they got killed by Praetorians, and the next
Why are they still there?
had a pretty good run. But he died in battle by treason, and that's just the first 6 years.
That sucks.
The next emperor died fighting this dude who battled with the gods and
got screwed.
And his son took over, which was shrewd, but then he died of plague. The next one got murdered by his own men. 2 months later,
and again,
and then came Emperor Valerian, captured by the Sassanids. Well, Valerian was forced to drink hot gold or skinned alive, depending how the jail sold. His son ruled for 15 years, then got trolled. His conspiracy murder again.
He's like, God damn it.
His successor died of plague after 1 year. And who killed the next guy?
Wobble.
But things evened out because no fear.
Here comes Aurelian. Hey!
Thank you. Vinyls and t-shirts are in the animated lobby. So even with just that song, you can kind of see that things weren't going great. But the crisis...
I mean, how are these, like, emperors keeping the Praetorian Guard around when year after year, nearly every time, even months at a time, would just... No emperor! No emperor! Just, it's like a factory line. Like, come on. Can we please just have him for a few years? Like, god damn, guys. What's with these Praetorian Guards? Like, ay. If I was made emperor, I would be like, okay, all Praetorian Guards fired. Get out. I'm disbanding you. Out. I'm just saying, I wouldn't trust them. Sheesh.
crisis wasn't just a political one. Even before that mess,
there it is.
emperors had played with debasing Roman currency, lowering the
Or
amount of
bits,
silver
silver
content
to-
in each coin.
Wow.
And now with emperor
That
after
low?
emperor scrambling to reward the people
80%.
who'd put them on the throne,
Made it a
they
5.
did it as a way of
Ouch.
basically printing money. This then created an economic crisis as people hoarded the coins that were not debased and only spent the debased ones. So on top of everything else, you
Jeez.
have inflation. And then right on time came plague, possibly smallpox or flu,
Uh-oh.
that devastated the population and made military recruitment difficult. Thus, more and more German tribesmen were inducted to fill the army's ranks. In the chaos, Rome could no longer reliably support local leaders in Gaul or the East, who started deciding that they were sick of being part of an empire that no longer came to their aid. If they had to stand alone, they'd do it as their own empires. And by 268,
Yeah, I think honestly,
the
I think
empire
it
had
started
torn into
shrinking
three
at
pieces.
least, you know?
The Roman Empire in Italy, the Gallic Empire in Gaul and Britain, and the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia to the east. But fighting in Eastern
Probably should have
Europe
stayed
under
in
the
the
command
Italian
of the
peninsula.
emperor himself was a
And,
man who
well,
would begin
Sicily,
to
of
turn the
course.
tide, who though born under humble circumstances would eventually be made emperor himself. And
Oh,
during
really?
his short reign, he'd cross the Mediterranean world to stitch the Roman Empire back together. Aurelian.
Speaking of, here he comes.
Northern Italy, 271. It's an ambush. Aurelian, acclaimed as emperor just a year before, has been fighting to turn back a Vandal invasion. But with the Roman army engaged, another Germanic tribe sees their chance to slip in the back door. They march into
Ambush!
northern Italy and begin to plunder. Alarmed, Aurelian races south, sending a demand ahead of him: surrender. But a messenger brings back their reply:
boy.
challenge us and see how a free people can
Dare ya.
fight. Aurelian was definitely seeing it now. The barbarians had ambushed his army as they moved through a forest. Now, Roman soldiers were nearly unbeatable on an open field,
Were nearly,
but in
but
this
still.
dense terrain, their ranks are broken and the men exhausted from the non-stop march. They flee with heavy casualties.
Oof.
And now, there is no force between the barbarians and Rome, a city up to this point considered so safe, it doesn't even have a defensive wall.
Ooh, that's
Rome
not good.
lies undefended, the emperor's army broken. The rich retreat to their villas in the countryside, priests call on gods for protection and consult oracles, and panic grips the streets. But Aurelian is not a man so easily cowed. He rallies his armies, puts down 2 revolts against his authority, and sends them into a pursuit. The enemy
sense.
is using the road network to march toward the capital. But here, the disciplined Roman troops move faster and overtake them. Aurelian pins the barbarians against the river, now on open ground that favors Roman tactics. And his attacks are so ferocious that when the barbarian force breaks, some flee into the river and drowned. For this, the Senate granted him the title Germanicus Maximus, the victor of Germania. And that was
Interesting.
just the first time Aurelian saved Rome, and it
Really?
would not be the last. In fact, Zoe, let's get that scoreboard in here.
All right.
Here we
thank you.
go. All right. Aurelian
First
won.
one for Aurelian.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So where did this
Yeah, this is
extraordinary
made back
guy
in
come from?
2020, so
Well,
you can see
we
what's
still
up.
don't totally know. In fact, a lot of things about his reign are still obscure, even what order events
Really?
happened in. Born a peasant in what is now Serbia, or possibly Bulgaria, Aurelian rose to the army during the 3rd century crisis, with the army eventually acclaiming him emperor when his old commanding officer, who had been emperor before him, died. He had to knock off the old emperor's brother first, of course. You know how these things go.
Yeah,
But within
true.
months,
Stab
Aurelian's
around.
rival was dead, and the Senate handed him the reins. Yet, unlike many of the short-term rulers of the crisis, Aurelian had a mission. He
What?
was going to reunite the empire. After defeating the barbarians'
Big one.
attempt at sacking Rome, he returned to the capital to enact a series of reforms, the first of which was
Okay.
symbolic as well as practical. He built a defensive wall. Now, technically, Rome already did have one, but it was 500 years old,
Yeah.
erected when the city was much smaller. And in the intervening centuries, the capital had sprawled beyond it like water overflowing a basin.
Oh, boy.
And a new wall had never been built because Rome wasn't thought to need it. In better times, enemies could never penetrate so far into Italy. But
Yeah,
these were
not
not
anymore.
better times. So Aurelian began construction, certain that Rome would need to defend itself again.
Good call.
And with that taken care of, he then turned to the economic crisis. Remember last episode
Oh,
when
right,
we
from
talked about how the
80%
gradual
to
debasing
5%.
of Roman
Ouch.
currency had created a monetary crisis? That was only part of it. Because while Aurelian started instituting a new law that coins had to be at least 5% silver, which for the record made them worth 20 times less than the full silver coins minted when things were going well, he ran across a scandal at the mint.
Uh-oh.
Corrupt employees were embezzling from the state by funneling some of the raw silver into their own pockets and debasing the currency even more. But when Aurelian put the head of the mint on trial, the other mint workers and their allies in the Senate staged an uprising that spread to the population, who were already restless due to a grain shortage. In response, Aurelian called in the army, and Roman troops fought vicious street battles against their own population, casualties running high as his army was pelted with cobblestones, once again forced to operate in a dense environment where their field tactics were no help. But in the end...
Eesh. So basically the guilty were that Aurelian was going to go after them once the scandal got exposed, was basically saying, "Hey, that's not fair. Let's rise up." Like, dude, really? And the people fell for it. Oops. That ain't good. I'm just saying, they ain't gonna go well.
He put down the revolt and reorganized the mint. Point Aurelian. That done, Aurelian marched into the Balkans, his home territory, to defeat an invasion of Goths.
Goth.
No, not those Goths, Nick. These Goths.
There you go.
Thus, the Senate gave him a new title of Gothicus Maximus, meaning, well,
Great
not
picture of the
that,
Goths.
but definitely another point on the board
That's
zone.
3.
Then, he turned his attention to reunifying the fractured empire, which had split into 3
They
parts
were
just
first.
before his reign began, large portions shearing off like an iceberg breaking apart. And of those parts, the Palmyrene Empire was the most worrisome. A decade before, Palmyra had been ruled by Odenathus, a king loyal to Rome who had saved the Eastern Empire from Sassanid invasion. But now that man was dead, and his wife Zenobia ruled on behalf of their young son. As Aurelian consolidated power, she too battled border raiders and rebels, bringing all of the East under her control while claiming to do so on behalf of Rome, though increasingly behaving like a separate empress. And then she invaded and occupied Egypt, which was a problem, since Egyptian grain sustained Rome. And if Aurelian moved against her, Zenobia could effectively starve the capital at a moment's notice. Remember that grain shortage during the Mint Revolt? Yeah, that was probably Zenobia. So Aurelian was not having it, partially because it was an affront to his rule, partially because he wanted to keep the empire whole, and partially because Rome was a misogynistic society who had a particular loathing for foreign queens. Like Cleopatra, the queen who also cut off Egyptian grain, and who Zenobia increasingly compared herself to in public. So yeah, Aurelian decided he would knock out Zenobia first. He dispatched a fleet
to take care of the grain shortage,
and at the same time, marched into Palmyrene territory. In response, Zenobia dropped the act and officially declared the Palmyrene Empire independent, crowning herself empress and her son emperor. Their forces met in open battle outside Antioch, the Roman troops exhausted from the march and the extreme heat. First came the infantry push. Palmyra's heavy cavalry smashed into the light Roman horsemen, driving them from the field in a pursuit. Seeing this, the Palmyrene general presses hard, sensing victory. He even sees his heavy cavalry returning on the horizon.
Sure about that?
This was too easy. Wait, what? Oh, those weren't Palmyrene horsemen. The Roman cavalry's break had been a feint. Aurelian had ordered them to pretend to flee in order to tire out the heavier Palmyrene riders.
Makes
then,
sense.
at an order, the Romans
swing around and
reformed
wham!
ranks, smashing into the now disordered enemy cavalry and quickly approaching the enemy infantry. The Palmyrene generals sounded retreat, knowing it was over. The next time the armies met, it was a replay.
Again?
The Palmyrene cavalry falling for the trick again.
Zenobia.
And for Zenobia, there was nowhere to go. So she held out in Palmyra, weathering Aurelian's siege, until internal politics forced her to go on the run, and Aurelian caught her as she tried to cross a river into Persia. Though he killed most of her generals and advisors, Zenobia he spared and sent back to Rome. Palmyra too he left untouched, at least until he spared and sent back to Rome. Palmyra too he left untouched, at least until he was eventually battling rebels in Egypt and found out the city once again revolted. Then he returned to flatten the place, pulling down its monuments and buildings. For this, the Senate named him Restitutor Orientis, Restorer of the East. And for that, another point for Aurelian.
That's 4.
Now, he looked to the west, but the so-called Gallic Empire there would not be so difficult. Aurelian broke the rebel army in a single battle, taking its emperor Tetricus prisoner. In fact, the whole battle may have just been a diplomatic maneuver, a way to get close enough to Tetricus, so the man who wanted to surrender but feared getting murdered by his captains could defect.
It does sound like payoff.
Aurelian sent the disgraced former emperor onto Rome, and then ordered the rest of the rebel army slaughtered. He'd done it. He defended the imperial borders, and sewn the riven empire back together. And for this, the Senate
Restorer
named
of the
him
world.
Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. And yet,
And
mark
number
it up.
5.
When Aurelian returned to Rome, he celebrated a military triumph, a ceremony that was part religious and part victory march. In this grand
And
parade,
that's surprising.
Aurelian's
Ooh,
soldiers and
elephants.
servants displayed exotic beasts from faraway lands, prisoners from kingdoms that Italians were only dimly aware of, and handed out free grain and bread reclaimed from Egypt. Then, near the parade's zenith, were the two most incredible prizes, Tetricus
Tetricus
and
and
Zenobia,
Zenobia.
renegade
Golden chains.
emperors of the East and West, chastened and humiliated, wearing gold chains. And finally came the emperor himself,
restorer himself.
mighty Aurelian, giving thanks to his personal deity, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. In 4 years, he had done what no other could, and within another year, he would be dead. Wait, really? No, I always have the worst luck in my fantasy emperor draft.
Womp womp. Well, yep, Aurelian's time is about to come to an end.
Near the Black Sea,
Black Sea.
275. Aurelian, Emperor of Rome, Restorer of the world, and victor of a dozen battles. Needs to empty his bladder.
Yeah, triggered.
He's waiting to cross into Asia to strike the Persians in a moment of weakness. Yet another eventual victory. Plus, he's already smashed a revolt and a Germanic army on the way here.
Man, go
He
Aurelian.
steps away to find a secluded spot, then realizes something's wrong. From behind, his officers have encircled him.
Uh-oh.
They begin drawing their swords. Aurelian, who
Shoot.
defeated enemies from Gaul to Syria and reunited the Roman Empire, dies under the blades of his own captains. He has reigned only 5 years, and the chaos rolls on. The officers who'd killed Aurelian regretted it almost immediately. They'd
Wait,
quickly
why?
launched the assassination plot after the emperor's secretary had presented them an execution list containing their names written in Aurelian's own hand, which was plausible because Aurelian was famous for harsh punishments. But they soon learned that list was a forgery.
Oh.
Aurelian's secretary, who'd been caught in a lie, hoped to kill Aurelian before the emperor discovered his infraction and punished him. And you know,
Wow, that's oh boy. Yeah, honestly, if I was guards and I learned that, I'd be like, oh shit. I guess they played safe since they knew how key could be. But I don't know. Like, if I was in his army, I think I would have been like, sir, is this one of yours? Because I kind of want to talk about why am I getting executed. I don't remember doing anything. Just saying. I don't want to talk to him. But then again, also run the risk of, are you kidding me? Off with his head. Jeez. Anyway, Diocletian's coming up.
that's history for you. It has its Julius Caesars,
Yeah?
people who die in great tragedies of betrayal
Recording.
and clashing ideals,
Busy.
stabbed on the floor of the Senate by his
Sorry, Mom.
peers to prevent him from becoming a tyrant. Then history has its Aurelians, a guy who saved the empire multiple times, and then was murdered for petty reasons while trying to take a leap.
Disputed,
But in his
Go
short
check it out
reign,
yourself, that was
Aurelian
short.
had done so much. He reunified the empire,
Mm-hmm.
smashed several Germanic invasions, and even started changing Roman religion. Aurelian was a
Oh, yeah, Sol
follower of the
Invictus.
god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, one of a variety of new approaches to religion that were increasingly popular in the later Roman Empire. While Roman religion was very public, with people making observances in the temples, many of these new factions
mystery
were closed
religions.
groups, known as mystery religions. Mystery
I
religions
think I remember
conducted
that
their
in the, like,
ceremonies
secret
in private
societies there.
gatherings,
Mhm.
where one could only take part if initiated, sort of both a religion and a private club. They also served as one-stop shops for religious needs, instead of appealing to a different god for every issue, and they emphasized
Fair.
spiritual books and revelations over tradition and ceremony. Sol Invictus, while publicly worshipped, seems to have also had a small mystery cult as well. And while emperor, Aurelian had promoted Sol Invictus, upgrading the status of his priests, building a new public temple, and putting his chosen deity among the chief gods of the empire.
Wow.
Aurelian also declared that the
December
god's
25th.
birthday, December 25th, would be a festival, and minted coins with his face on one side and Sol Invictus's on the other. This association
Wow.
between Sol Invictus and the emperor would carry on among his imperial successors, with them also
It's like
worshipping the sun
Diocletian.
god and putting him on coins. In fact, Sol Invictus and other mystery religions
on the-
would have a major impact on the small illegal sect called Christianity. But we'll get to that later, because right now, our story has some more
Still
emperors
need
to kill.
Diocletian.
After Aurelian's death, the Senate elected a new emperor, who died after 9 months from natural causes, dramatic question mark, when the throne then passed to his brother, who was killed by his
goodbye.
own troops 3 months later in favor of another
Jeez,
guy
a
who
year.
ruled 6 years before also being
Oh,
dragged. The next one in line was Carus, who ascended in
Okay.
282. But that's also
Oh,
where
and there he is.
Diocletian
Hi,
enters the picture,
Diocletian.
getting named
That
commander
face.
of an elite cavalry unit attached to the emperor's household,
That's
which
face.
probably meant he'd been part of the plot to assassinate the previous emperor. Now, we know little of Diocletian's origins, though like many of the
Any of these
military
even
emperors,
go
they
for
were
it?
humble.
Huh.
Born in modern-day Croatia to a father who was reportedly a former
Sense.
slave, he rocketed up through the military ranks during the crisis. He followed Carus to Persia on yet another campaign,
Yeehaw!
because Rome was just like constantly at war with Persia. Anyway, things were going great. You know,
But
apart from
then
the emperor
Carus
being
got-
tragically struck by lightning just before he
And
celebrated a
bye-bye.
year of rule. Killed by
Aw.
lightning. Freak accident. Or
He's
maybe
like,
it
"Get
was
away from
Persian
him."
soldiers, not by Diocletian. Carus's sons
Just like the
took
guard
over
next
as
to him, just like,
co-emperors.
okay,
one going
making
to
sure
Rome,
I'm not
and
getting
the
in his
other
way.
staying in the east to start withdrawing troops from Persia. But during the withdrawal, the Eastern Emperor developed an eye inflammation and decided to travel the rest of the way in a coach with the curtains drawn, which was going fine until someone noticed a smell.
Uh-oh.
They opened the curtains to
Ooh.
find the young emperor dead by disease, or maybe possibly poisoned by someone who was not Diocletian.
Not me.
The generals convened to name a new emperor, with 2 men
what?
now standing as candidate, Diocletian
Diocletian?
and another
Oh,
guy
just-
who was not Diocletian.
Ouch.
Diocletian went out,
Not
and the next day,
Diocletian.
the army gathered to look at him on a hilltop, acclaiming him emperor. And before the troops, Diocletian raised his sword and swore an oath on
Yeah?
Sol Invictus that he had not killed the young emperor. Then he swore that he personally knew that his rival candidate, not Diocletian, had killed the young emperor. To which not Diocletian
like,
raised a finger
"Hey,
and
can I
said,
say-"
And then
Eh,
Diocletian
okay.
buried his sword in the man's chest, killing
Wow.
him instantly, and thereby avenging the
That's just
emperor,
face.
who was definitely not killed by Diocletian. Great!
Oh,
6
boy.
months later, Diocletian, then confirmed by the Senate, clashed in battle with the Western Emperor, who was technically his co-ruler. Diocletian's army was outnumbered, their prospects bleak. Nervous lines of men shuffled toward each other. But you'll never guess
Let me
what
guess.
happened.
The other guy died.
One of the Western Emperor's commanders
there you go.
stabbed the guy in the back and defected to Diocletian, winning the battle. And not because Diocletian paid him to do it or gave him a high office afterward. I mean, he did do
Come
that,
on.
but that wasn't why he betrayed his old emperor, because that emperor was totally sleeping with everyone's wives, and no one really liked him anyway. So it wasn't
Wow.
Diocletian's fault. I mean, really? Really? Right now, you're probably
Yeah.
thinking, wait, back in Ep 1, you said Diocletian was going to save the empire. But
Sounds
all
like
this
he's
civil
still
warring
using
and
the same
convenient
act-
accidents sounds a lot like he's more of the same.
True.
And you're right. In 285, when Diocletian
The
took the
bloody
throne,
merry-go-round.
it looked like he was just another spin on Rome's merry-go-round of imperial murder. But it didn't play out that way. Diocletian didn't
Huh?
carry out any campaigns of retribution against those that supported his rivals.
Whew.
In fact, they mostly kept their positions. And that's
True,
because
mostly,
this
but
new
so
emperor
you get the idea.
considered himself a restorer, not a revolutionary. And his goal
Mhm.
was to save the empire by turning the clock back before the 3rd century crisis. And he was willing to, essentially, remake society to do it, changing everything from the military to the administration to taxation. His 3 priorities
sense.
of reform were as follows. 1. Secure the far-flung edges of the empire from outside attack. 2. Stop the runaway inflation and low tax yields that had hobbled the economy. And 3. Solve the succession problem that had allowed the crisis to roll on and on. Now, like a lot of
Yep,
things in the
let's
3rd
see.
century crisis,
See how that
we don't
goes
always
from.
know what order things happened in during Diocletian's reign. So to keep things simple, we're going to talk about his reforms piece by piece, beginning as
So, first
Diocletian
up,
did
military.
with the military. Understanding the threat of
Right.
assassination and the fact that the empire was too large to govern, Diocletian raised one of his fellow military officers,
Excellent.
Maximian, to the office of subordinate co-emperor. Maximian would rule the west, and Diocletian would rule the more populous and rich east. Immediately after this agreement, they both set off to their respective
So two
halves
emperors,
to halt border
that's one for each
incursions
side.
and put down uprisings. And it was during these campaigns that Diocletian started to formulate his plans to reorganize the Roman Empire around the military. He pushed for more troops to defend the empire, reinstituting conscription to expand the military's manpower by at least a third, possibly even doubling it. And most of these new units were mounted. See, Diocletian was a former cavalry general and had seen Roman horsemen prove effective during the crisis. Not only
sense.
in mowing down the infantry armies of Germanic tribes, but in simply getting where they were needed faster. In his new plan,
True.
reinforced and expanded border forts would have a group of infantry to hold them against attack just long enough for a cavalry detachment from further inside the empire to come to their aid. Also, Rome would no longer be the place to rally troops. Instead, he expanded or founded cities like Milan in Italy, Trier in current-day Germany, and Antioch. And they essentially became miniature Romes, with all of the theaters, arenas, and temples of a modern city, so military figures could live there long-term, closer to trouble spots. And in those cities, he broke up the power of governors, making military command separate from administration, so that when the troops did march away, the city could keep running as normal. But all of those forts, cities, men, and horses cost something he didn't have: money. To build up the military, Diocletian will essentially turn the Roman Empire into an enormous support system for the army, rebuilding society around it. And in doing so, he will inaugurate a new era for Rome, a more dictatorial period where he held autocratic, even divine power, and then divided that new authority between 4 men known as the Tetrarchy.
Speaking of which, here it comes.
St. Mark's Square, Venice, March 2020. The square is empty, ghostly. Monuments usually haloed by tourists now stand alone and bare. Metal catwalks, deployed when the rising waters cover the flagstones, sit unused in a stack. It's not the high water that worries people now. Only at the corner of the church do 4 men gather, arms interlocked, faces nearly meeting, stone men. This statue was not made by the Venetian Republic. Rampaging soldiers looted it from Constantinople in 1204, where they decorated a pair of columns, forming a gateway to a public square. A representation of 4 men who bound the empire together before tearing it apart. The Tetrarchy. We talked about how Diocletian embarked on his program of reform by remaking the Roman army, relieving them of most civic administrative duties, and stationing them closer to the borders. And he would soon test the mettle of this new army against the Sarmatians, the Persians, an uprising in Gaul, an uprising in Britain, and the ever-present threat of Germanic incursion. In fact, he would be fighting for much of his reign. Aside from war, Diocletian had a to-do list of 3 things: secure the empire, stabilize the economy and tax collection, and solve the succession problem. With his military reforms, he did have item 1, secure the frontiers, mostly in hand. But to really create lasting security, he needed to tackle the economy and create an administrative system that supported that new expanded military. And look, I know that administration and tax reform is not as, let's say, sexy as assassination and civil war, but it's important to remember that both of those things are bad. No matter how catchy a song we sang about them in episode 1, Diocletian wanted to stop this cycle of instability. And like many times in history, the exciting problems needed rather dull solutions. And while it works, right? His solution to the succession crisis is what Diocletian is most famous for, it was actually his administrative and tax reforms that truly lasted. In fact, when the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, it was still using Diocletian's system over 1,000 years later. And getting the economy on an even keel was just as important as military reform. Because while ordinary people didn't much care who the emperor was, the coups of the 3rd century crisis being mostly an elite and military affair, the people cared a lot when inflation meant they couldn't afford food. That, of course, led to civil unrest. During the crisis, armies had marched around, forcefully requisitioning goods to supply themselves, and paying largely in a nearly worthless debased coin. A fact that meant bad currency was spreading around the empire, feeding the inflation crisis. Diocletian tried to reform the coinage, minting a new set of coins that he hoped would stabilize currency. But unfortunately, these coins effectively cost the government more to produce than they were actually worth. And to make it work, he had to seize metals from rich Roman families and then repay them in the same value in coin. He did many things to fight inflation, from trying to restructure people's debts to creating an empire-wide edict stating the maximum price for 1,000 types of goods. But none of it really worked, because even basic economic forces like supply and demand were not yet understood back then. And that meant that pretty much any of Diocletian's economic policies were dead on arrival. His work on the tax system, though, was extremely successful. See, the problem was that he needed revenue to support the army. But Rome's current tax system was broken and easy to evade. In fact, really, there wasn't much of a formal system at all. When it needed support, the state just sort of took what it needed in forced purchases. Wealthy
So?
Romans would also contribute to
yeah,
institutions or
Quintus.
works as a way to up their prestige, though that system was also breaking down. To set things right, Diocletian instituted a new class of tax assessors and census takers who would fan out all over the empire every 5 years and assess the value of land based on acreage, the number of tenants living on it, and the goods it produced. Then the assessor would create a tax rate based on that equation, which the landowner would pay to a new type of local tax official. Who said these solutions
Fair
weren't
enough.
going to be sexy?
I
And if
text that.
revenues fell short of what they should be, that
Uh-oh.
tax official would have to make up the difference themselves. Punishments for non-payment could also fall on the landowners in the form of collective fines. And since
Hey, goes to show you. Hey, you can't get it from the cities. Just get it from the people that actually own the land. Hey, they're the one that's supposed to be paying it, not you. Honestly, I feel like we could use that here, since I know a lot of people that can really evade tax easily. Hey, it's true. Anyway.
the amount paid by each landowner was public knowledge, if someone didn't pay their fair share and everyone in the region had to pay a fine, they knew exactly who to blame. Overall, Diocletian's tax system was a step forward, but it also fell heavy on local elites, accelerating a decline in their wealth and status, which had already dropped during the crisis. Because you see, with the military seizing so much authority, power and wealth tended to cluster around army officers that moved around, rather than aristocrats who were rooted in place. As a result, these local elites started giving less to institutions, particularly temples, right at a time when Roman polytheism was starting to lose ground to a wave of more mystical religions, including Christianity. Which is ironic, because while Diocletian was no friend to Christianity, a fact we'll talk about next episode, his reforms were not just giving the upstart religion space to grow, but they were actively building structures it would model itself on. Part of Diocletian's administrative reforms were an enormous expansion of the Roman civil service, possibly even doubling the number of bureaucrats. He did away with the idea of the emperor ruling in conjunction with the Senate and military, and demoted his council of advisors to government functionaries. At times, this was for safety. For instance, the Praetorian Guard, responsible for so many imperial murders, now became Rome's city garrison, rather than the emperor's guards/assassins-in-waiting. He also doubled the number of provinces from 50 to 100, facilitating tax collection and ensuring that no local official could create a big enough power base to oppose him. Multiple provinces would also be drawn into larger groups called a diocese and overseen by a government official known as a vicarius. And if you're thinking those terms sound familiar, it's because when Christianity became the official religion of the empire, the church would adopt this organization for itself. Catholic churches still have dioceses and vicars. Also, fun trivia, Diocletian created a local military rank called the Duck, which is where we get the word Duke, which additional fun fact that just came to my mind was the name of my first dog. Oh, miss you, buddy. The result of all of this was that Rome became an autocracy with the emperor at the top, making executive decisions that would be implemented by a strict hierarchy of administrators organized into specific departments.
Makes sense.
In the early Roman Empire, there was always a feeling that the emperor was a man of the people, the first citizen. In fact, there are stories of emperors being approached on the street by citizens or speaking to large crowds. But no more of that stuff. In Diocletian's empire, the emperor would be a distant, godlike figure, rarely seen in public. And when he did show himself, it was a carefully managed performance, where he stood like a statue. And you did not look directly at the emperor. He was the god's representative on Earth. A fact that, conveniently, made any military coup against him sacrilege. But there was still too much empire to govern, even for a god-appointed ruler. And succession was still a problem. In 285, the first year of his reign, Diocletian appointed his trusted captain, Maximian, to be his Caesar, a title that designated a sort of junior emperor, and one which was ultimately subordinate to Diocletian, who had the more senior imperial title, Augustus. Diocletian would rule his home territory in the more powerful and prosperous east, while Maximian would handle the west. Now you would think that the chief emperor would rule from Rome, but the fact was that Rome was becoming less and less important to the Roman Empire. The Senate was an irrelevant joke, the territory was no longer the wealthiest, and its location not very strategic. So Maximian instead ruled from Milan. But 8 years into this power-sharing agreement, it was clear that even this division was not enough. The empire was still too big, and the succession uncertain. and Maximian had been bogged down the entire time fighting a breakaway state in Gaul. So Diocletian
There it
unveiled
is,
a new
tetrarchy.
concept, the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. He would elevate Maximian from Caesar to Diocletian's rank of Augustus.
To
They would be
Augustus
fully
and
co-equal,
two
and
Caesars.
each
Okay.
take on a Caesar of their own, who would serve as a junior partner and replace them when they died. Maximian
makes
chose
sense.
his son-in-law Constantius, who ruled Gaul and Britain, while Maximian handled Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, and North Africa. Then Diocletian would rule the east, giving Greece and the Balkan region to his own son-in-law
Galerius.
Galerius. The concept quickly
See you
proved its
guys.
worth, with both father-son teams departing to win victories over breakaway elements and uprisings.
Yeah.
A few years later, they would turn back a Persian invasion and even strike back into Persia. It worked. It would
For
endure.
years?
Diocletian had found the perfect solution,
captures.
finally
All right,
solving
gotta
the
see this
succession
later.
problem. Everything was going to be okay.
But then, yeah. Persecution time. Just saying, sometimes House Divide can't stand.
Antioch,
Oh,
302. Diocletian and Galerius are conducting the state sacrifices, thanking the gods for a successful campaign against the Persians and an empire at peace. Suddenly, a shout. A man pushes his way to the front of the crowd.
hi.
He denounces the emperors and the priests, claiming that their idols are false. He says that the god Jesus is the
Yeah,
one
it's
true
still not-
God. It is Romanus, a deacon of the meddlesome Christians. He's interrupted the sacrifice, angering the gods and bringing danger to the empire. Galerius orders him burned. Diocletian, however, cancels the order. Instead, he tells the soldiers to cut out the man's tongue. Then
Eesh.
he is beaten and strangled to death. This was one of the first acts in the Great Persecution, Diocletian's attempt to
a
stamp
martyr.
out Christianity once and for all. One of the defining features of the Roman Empire was its religious tolerance. Now, that might
Well,
surprise you given
yeah,
the theme
'cause
we
everyone
opened
would just
with,
solve-
along
not
with stories of martyrdom from later Christian writers. But research shows that Christianity was really the exception when it came to Roman religious policy. And the persecutions that did happen were not as consistent as later writers claimed. As polytheistic
Makes sense.
pagans, the Roman state didn't really care what god you worshipped, provided it was compatible with state values. Even monotheistic Judaism received some accommodations, since it was
Fair enough.
respected for being
Politics,
ancient.
okay, makes sense.
Christianity, by contrast, was a new religion and deeply subversive. Its central figure had been a living person executed by the Roman state. They met in secret illegal assemblies and refused to make a libation, a sacrifice of wine or rice to the emperor's image. They denied and denigrated the gods of state like Jupiter and Sol Invictus, and also, its followers were pacifist, unacceptable to the warlike Romans, and actively trying to spread their religion. But while Christians experienced
I guess that's fair, but I mean, remember, they're kind of a war state, so them being pacifists does make sense. You know, can't really have them doing just hanging around. Probably be more morale, I guess. Anyway,
discrimination and violence since the empire's founding. For centuries, that persecution was not state-sponsored. Pagan mobs might attack Christian neighbors, or a local official led a crackdown. Though at times, emperors like Nero would massacre Christians as a scapegoat for unrelated problems, like the Great Fire. But there was no
Yeah, that sounds like
concerted
Nero.
empire-wide persecution. State violence tended to be brief and highly local. But as Christianity became more widespread, building churches and attracting the rich and powerful as well as the poor, the government considered it more of a threat. Early in the 3rd century crisis, official persecutions began to ramp up, with emperors like Valerian insisting that all citizens make a public
Hey, Valerian,
sacrifice
welcome
to the
back.
gods on pain of arrest. But then Valerian's son reversed the policy, giving the fledgling religion 40 years of peace to recover. Then came Diocletian.
right.
Diocletian saw himself
Not
as a
good.
restorer, a man who would turn back the clock to a glorified Roman past that existed largely in his imagination rather than fact. And in his idealized version of Rome, there was
Neighbors.
no room for Christianity. But despite surrounding himself with anti-Christian advisors, he took no action until he and Galerius had trounced Persia in a war, letting him turn his attention inward. It started small, with the purge of the army. All soldiers had to make a public sacrifice or face discharge and loss of rank. Then Diocletian ordered that the Manichaeans, a Christian-like group with their own prophet, be burned along with their sacred books.
Yikes.
And shortly afterward, in 303, Romanus interrupted
Oh, yeah.
the state ceremonies. That's when Galerius, a devout pagan, began working on Diocletian to do something about this rogue religion. Diocletian assented to an
Yeesh.
official, empire-wide suppression of Christianity, enshrined in law. They started by pulling down a large church in Diocletian's capital of Nicomedia, with Roman soldiers looting the building's valuables and burning its library. He then issued...
Yeah, that's one way to stop the religion. Burn the text. I mean, hey, can't spread the word, can't spread the religion. That's how most religion spreads, just spreading their work. Inevitably. I mean, seriously, what did we do to these guys? They'd be like, we hate all Christians, get them. Like, what the heck? Anyway.
Issued an edict against Christians, the first of several, ordering that all gatherings of worship must cease immediately. All churches would be destroyed and their religious texts surrendered for burning. Any Christians holding official offices in the army, the Senate, or administration immediately lost their posts.
Ouch.
Their property could be confiscated. Freed slaves returned to slavery. Christians could not attest before a court and were open to judicial torture. Later edicts ordered the imprisonment of all priests, only to be released if they made libation to the emperor, and demanded that the population of whole cities gather in the public square to make sacrifice. Those who refused were immediately executed. This was by far the worst official persecution of Christians in Roman history, and from it arose the cult of the martyrs, a form of veneration surrounding those who refused to renounce their faith on pain of death that would eventually evolve into the concept of sainthood. But while stories of martyrdom like that of Romans tend to fire our imaginations, it's important to remember that it wasn't the norm. In fact, the vast majority of Christians avoided these punishments by faking compliance. They surrendered less important texts to burn, hiding the valuable ones. And many made sacrifices, publicly renouncing their faith while still worshiping in private. There were even commentaries on why coerced renunciation was not a sin, making it a sort of get-out-of-martyrdom free card. So while no one would ever become a saint for it, Christianity's survival was probably due more to people issuing false renunciations than burning for their faith. After all, someone needed to survive. Again, sometimes interesting problems have boring solutions. Also an important note, the persecutions weren't empire-wide. Because while Diocletian and Galerius were very into hunting Christians, the Western emperors were less enthusiastic. In Gaul and Britain, Constantius enacted the first edict selectively and never bothered about the rest. In fact, that difference in enforcement revealed an issue with the Tetrarchy. It had created a major east-west split in the empire, one that would become increasingly entrenched and official. Turns out, Diocletian's reform had, effectively, cut the empire in two. But he didn't know that. In fact, in 305, Diocletian, already ill, felt good enough about the empire to retire. For 21 years, he'd vanquished all enemies, foreign and domestic, pulling the Roman state out of freefall. So, he held a meeting where he and Maximian announced that they would cede the office of Augustus to their sons, and that they must pick their own Caesars. Diocletian then left, retiring to an enormous palace in current-day Croatia. There, he kept up with politics, but mostly tended to his garden with his own hands. With Diocletian's love for order, we can imagine him looking with pride at his crops, all of them in neat little rows. The Tetrarchy, by contrast, was not in neat little rows. With the empire split into four, arguments about succession only became more complicated and violent. And when the two new emperors picked their Caesars, they passed over their only adult sons, both of whom rallied armies and plunged the empire into yet another succession crisis.
God damn it.
Maximian even came out of retirement and tried to be emperor again. 3 years after his retirement, Diocletian attended a conference to try and work out the problem. There were 4 people claiming to be Augustus, and only 1 with the title of Caesar. Nothing got worked out, and the civil war continued. Diplomats came to Diocletian's palace and asked him to return to power, to partner with Galerius, and bring security to the empire once again. Diocletian declined, saying that if the emperor could see the cabbages he'd planted, he wouldn't dare suggest I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed. Diocletian died in his palace, possibly by suicide, before the civil war resolved. He had, in some ways, ended the 3rd century crisis. Building on what Aurelian had done, he'd managed to reform the empire into a framework that would stand for over a century in the West and a millennium in the East. Yet, paradoxically, outside of administration, tax, and military matters, most of his reforms failed. Rome's economy was still shaky, the Tetrarchy tore itself apart, and his attempt to stamp out Christianity was, well, let's just say there's a lot more church steeples here in New York than temples to Jupiter. Yet despite things not getting better, they weren't
That's gotta
getting
hurt for
worse.
Diocletian.
Household mosaics from the end of his reign say things like, happy times all around, showing that, even though we know that the Western Empire would collapse in a century, ordinary Romans were optimistic about the future. But the next great
Fair.
change was coming. Because, remember Constantius? Well, his son, who was passed over for Caesar, would end up winning the Civil War, eventually becoming Augustus of the Empire. Constantine the Great. He would finish Diocletian's work, reforming the currency and instituting a line of succession in his family. And a mere 2 years after Diocletian's death, he ended the Great Persecution and began to favor Christianity, even converting on his deathbed in 339. The Roman world was becoming the medieval world, with the 3rd century crisis a thing only remembered by the old. But we did remember.
True. I mean, you're not wrong. Makes sense. I mean, they lived it. We didn't. So, we'll definitely remember it more. Whew. So, there you go. Complete extra history on the 3rd century crisis. I don't know if I should do more of this, because frankly, I do know I'm missing a lot. So, till next time, see ya.